Behind the perfect white picket fence and Donna Eleanor's gentle smile lurked a past no one dared speak of. She was the grandmother who offered cookies, the neighbor who tended the flowers, the elderly woman everyone respected. But no one knew what lay in the basement or why at night some windows lit up by themselves. When a young volunteer begins visiting her, she discovers that the darkest secrets don't live in cemeteries. They live in people. And time, even when it seems calm, always brings its bill. Get ready for a dense story, full of mystery, guilt, and redemption. Eleanor's past is about to be revealed, and it may be too late for forgiveness. Click play and discover the true face of karma. At the end of a quiet street in Savannah, Georgia, stood a house with blue shutters, a weathered roof, and a garden that defied time. Rosalie Bennett had lived there for as long as she could remember. The old mansion had been passed down from generation to generation, and with it, her family's secrets. At 78, Rosalie was known to all as the Lady of the Garden. She cultivated rose bushes with such devotion that they always seemed in bloom, even in the cold months. But behind the welcoming appearance and soft voice, there was a past buried beneath the land she loved so much. No one imagined that this elderly woman, with her white hair tied in a tight bun and wrinkled hands always stained with dirt, would have such a keen eye for other people's behavior. Rosalie observed. She observed the neighbors, the mailmen, the young people who passed by on their bicycles, and even the crows that perched on the back wall. She saw it all, and remembered it all. His daily routine was simple. He woke up at 5 a.m., drank black tea, watered his plants, and sat on the porch with a brown-covered notebook. There he wrote what he called lessons from the world. What others didn't know was that the notebook was more than a diary. It was a list of names. Rosalie believed in balance, and when life seemed unfair, she took it upon herself to restore the balance. It was on a muggy July afternoon that everything began to unfold. A new neighbor had moved in next door, a woman in her early 30s with tanned skin, hair as straight as black silk, and an accent that didn't belong in the city. Her name was Viviane Morales, recently arrived from Miami. She seemed too nice, too helpful, and that bothered Rosalie. She watched her new neighbor offer lemonade to strangers, greet children on the street, and smile easily. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match that smile. Rosalie knew fake smiles. She knew that the worst poison came wrapped in sweetness. During the first week, Viviane tried several times to talk to the garden lady. She offered cookies, asked for tips on how to keep the rose bushes alive, and even complimented the elderly woman's clean nails, even though they were blackened by the dirt. Rosalie smiled politely, but she wasn't fooled. "She's like a snake in the sun," she said to herself as she pruned a dead branch. During the second week, Rosalie noticed strange movements at Viviane's house at night. A black car would park in front around 2 a.m., stay for a few minutes, then disappear. Rosalie wrote down the license plates. Every single one. One day, after one of these nocturnal encounters, Rosalie found her cat, Tobias, dead in the backyard. He had been poisoned. She didn't cry. She didn't call the police. She just went to her closet, grabbed her brown notebook, and wrote, "Viviane Morales, imbalance caused." The next day, Rosalie made tea. But it wasn't just any tea. He mixed jasmine flowers with foxglove leaves, a plant he grew only in the darkest part of the garden. The dose was precise, just enough to cause fainting, a slight memory loss. Nothing lethal, just a warning. She offered to visit Viviane with a teapot and 2 cups. The neighbor accepted, thrilled by the attention. "How kind," Viviane said. "I finally found a friend here." "We all get what we deserve," Rosalie replied, smiling. That night, the black car returned, but this time it left without the driver. Viviane was found slumped on the sofa, showing signs of mild intoxication. The police suspected expired medication. She herself couldn't remember what she had taken. Rosalie continued with her roses. She continued with her notebook. But what she didn't know was that Viviane wasn't just a new neighbor. She was an undercover federal investigator sent to observe suspicious activity on the street, and Rosalie had been on her watch list for longer than she realized. Mrs. Marlene's home perfectly reflected her public image, well kept, charming, and organized. The garden was always in bloom, the gate was freshly painted, and the porch exuded the gentle scent of jasmine, which she had insisted on cultivating since moving to the neighborhood almost 20 years earlier. To her neighbors, she was the sweet and helpful grandmother who offered cakes on rainy days and helped with church outreaches. But one had only to step through that door for a very different truth to be revealed. Marlene wasn't evil, at least not explicitly. She'd simply learned throughout her life that controlling people was more effective than loving them. She was a proud and vain woman who made a point of maintaining an appearance of kindness and wisdom. But behind that gentle smile lay veiled criticism, emotional blackmail, and a constant need for superiority. At 72, Marlene had been living alone since the death of her husband, Benedito, to whom she had been married for 40 years. Many believed she was an inconsolable widow, a woman who had never recovered from her loss. The truth was that Benedito had endured a lifetime of silent manipulation, silenced by the calculated looks and words of a wife who always knew how to twist situations to her advantage. He died of a heart attack, they say, but those who knew the couple's dynamics, and they were few, knew that in life he was already slowly dying. Her children, Juliana and Roberto, kept their distance. They saw her on obligatory holidays, sent flowers on Mother's Day, and tried to convince their own children that Grandma is just a little difficult, but she's good deep down. But not even the children felt comfortable in that house. The toys they brought were stored with surgical precision, and any crumb on the sofa was grounds for a lecture. Marlene's sweetness was actually a veneer, but that morning something was different. Marlene woke with a strange pain in her left leg, a heaviness that wasn't physical but seemed to radiate from her skin to her bones. She ignored it, as she always had with anything she couldn't control. She made herself coffee with bread and butter, read the news on her tablet, and there, a headline caught her eye. Woman found dead in abandoned house. Neighbors report screams in the early hours. The news wasn't from her city or even her state, but for some reason it resonated with her. There was something familiar about the image of the house. And then came the shiver, a name buried in time, a memory from many years ago. Carmem. Carmem had been her best friend in her youth. They grew up together, sharing dreams and secrets, but over time their friendship soured, out of envy, jealousy, pride. Marlene never admitted it out loud, but she had sabotaged Carmem more than once, spreading rumors that drove her away from a suitor, convincing other friends she was unstable, even forging a letter that resulted in her losing a job. It was cruel, and he never looked back. Now, seeing that news, she felt a rare discomfort, guilt, but it didn't last. It was so long ago, she must have deserved it, she muttered to herself as she brushed the crumbs off the table. She replaced the veil of indifference and went on with her day. But the pain in his leg persisted, and that night, as he lay in bed, a cold sensation ran through him. He felt as if someone were in the room watching. He sat up in bed, looked around. Nothing. But the silence was oppressive. For the first time in years, Marlene felt real fear. And it wasn't of death. It was of the judgment that somehow she knew was approaching. That week, her closest neighbor, Donna Aurea, suffered a stroke. Marlene, as usual, brought flowers. But when she entered the hospital and looked into the elderly woman's eyes in the bed, something strange happened. Aurea looked at her with terror, as if she recognized a shadow in her. She mumbled something incomprehensible before turning her face away. On the way back, Marlene tripped on the sidewalk. She fell hard, scraping her knees like a child. A homeless man helped her up. When she thanked him, he looked at her with a toothless smile and said, "The fall was just the beginning, ma'am. There are a lot of bills to pay." She paled. That sentence echoed like thunder in her mind. That night, as he tried to sleep, He heard a whisper coming from the hallway. "Did you think we would forget?" The cold crept up the walls, and for the first time in decades Marlene cried, but not from pain. She cried from regret and fear. Karma, she would discover, did not forget. Mornings in the Cedar Grove neighborhood became routine for Donna Helen. Chamomile tea, newspaper on the porch, and morning walks with her cane, and a welcoming smile for each neighbor. In the eyes of the community, she was the epitome of a loving grandmother, discreet, sweet, with trembling hands that offered oatmeal cookies to children and wise words to lost youth. But behind the crocheted curtain and the scent of lavender, the old woman hid deep cracks, and the universe began to pull at the threads of the veil with which she covered her past. The young volunteer nurse, Mia, stopped by twice a week to help with the medications. She was kind, always with a lopsided bun and a soft voice. At first, Helen treated her cordially, but gradually she began to feel uncomfortable in her presence. Mia asked too many questions. About the house, about old documents, about the elderly woman's family. And it was on a rainy late afternoon that Mia asked something that made Helen's blood run cold. "Mrs. Helen, have you ever heard of the name Lucille Harland?" Helen pretended not to recognize it, but the name struck her like a bolt of lightning. It was the name she had used as a young woman in another state before disappearing off the face of the earth. Mia noticed the hesitation. "I'm helping a friend with a genealogy project. We found a similar name, and you remind me so much of an old photo." From that day on, Helen locked her doors before the sun even set. She slept with a butter knife under her pillow, and she spoke less, smiled less. The world she had painstakingly rebuilt over decades threatened to crumble with a single name. 3 weeks later, a black car pulled discreetly onto the street. Helen saw it through the high kitchen window as she was cutting apples for her famous pie. A man in a dark overcoat and a cold expression got out and stood in front of the white picket fence. His eyes scanned the facade of the house as if searching for memories. Helen fell to her feet, breathless. That silhouette, even aged, was unmistakable. His name was Gregory Stein, the brother of her childhood best friend, the man who swore to avenge his sister's misfortune. In her youth, Helen had convinced her friend, Margaret, to invest the family's savings in a fraudulent business. She fled with the money shortly before bankruptcy, and Margaret, ashamed and ruined, took her own life. Helen learned of the suicide in an anonymous letter, but chose to ignore it. She never imagined Gregory would find her. You never imagined he would wait 40 years. The man didn't knock. He just watched. He left a letter under the gate and left. Helen opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was just one sentence in firm handwriting. "You thought time would erase your debt." From that day on, the house became a living tomb. The phone rang with silent calls. Cards with letters cut out of magazines began to appear in the garden. What goes around comes around. Remember Margaret? There is still time to confess. A worried Mia tried to help, but Helen pushed everyone away. He refused to admit anything was wrong. He preferred to believe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the truth weighed heavily, and the universe had already decided it was time for a tune-up. One night, the power went out. Helen, using a flashlight, found a cross drawn in ash on her bed. The police were called, but they found nothing. No cameras recorded the intruder, no footprints, no explanation, just silence. And then something unexpected. Mia came back with an old envelope. "I found this file in a clothing drive at the church. I think it was for you." It was a file on Lucille Harland, with photos, school records, a signed contract, and a handwritten letter that said, "Dear Lucille, even with everything you've done, I forgive you. But the world may not. If you ever want to make peace with the past, tell the truth, before fate does it for you." Margaret Helen broke down. The letter was real. Margaret had tried to forgive her before the tragedy, and Helen had thrown it all away in the name of pride. That night, for the first time in decades, she wrote something in her diary. The complete truth. Signed, Detailed. A. Document that the next day she would drop off at the city police station. But when the sun rose, Helen was no longer home, nor was the diary. In the city center, a poster appeared stuck to several posts. Lucille Harland confesses everything. Justice does not fail, nor does it grow old. The local newspaper headline exploded. Elderly woman mysteriously disappears after confessing to historical fraud that led to young man's suicide in the 1980s. Fate exacted its toll, not with screams, but with echoes. Gregory was never seen again. Mia resigned from the clinic, but a neighbor said she saw the nurse climb into the black car that had previously been parked on the street, and strangely, she smiled. That night was especially long for Dona Eulalia. Sitting in her maroon velvet armchair, the living room clock seemed to mock the silence. Each tick echoed like a whisper from the past that refused to die. Ever since the strange events began, she had avoided turning off all the lights. There was something in the darkness that seemed to want to talk to her, or judge her. At midnight sharp, the old-fashioned wall phone rang. A phone she hadn't used in years now sounded as if it had never been turned off. She answered, trembling. "Hello?" On the other side, silence. And then a childish voice, muffled, as if coming from scratched vinyl. "Grandma, why didn't you wait for me at the gate?" Eulalia dropped the phone. She ran to the living room mirror and stared at her reflection. For a moment, she swore she saw her younger self, dressed in the same blue dress she'd worn to her granddaughter Laura's funeral. The face in the mirror wasn't crying. It was smiling. Cold. Ever since Laura's death, a tragic accident at a nearby lake, Eulalia had carried a guilt she'd never confessed to anyone. Laura had asked her to accompany her to play near the water. Her grandmother, busy organizing a party for her church friends, had told her to go alone. When she realized the girl was missing, it was too late. She never told the girl's parents. She said it had been impossible to predict. Now, voices, shadows, and reflections exacted the price for the lie. In the following days, the demonstrations increased. The kettle boiled on its own. The kitchen radio played old nursery rhymes when it wasn't turned on. And twice the doorbell rang at 3:33 a.m., with no one at the door, except a porcelain doll left on the steps, its eyes painted with red tears. Eulalia tried to seek help. She went to the local parish, but the priest refused to hear her confession. "What you have inside, my daughter, is not just sin, it is selfishness, and selfishness takes root deeper than hell." Desperate, she turned to a local faith healer, Dona Silvia. As she crossed the threshold of the healer's house, she felt a sudden chill, even in the middle of summer. Silvia refused to touch Eulalia. "There's something stuck to your skin, something ancient, something you created and nurtured, and now it won't come out." "He?" "A spirit, not of your granddaughter, but of the guilt you stifled." It took form. That night, Eulalia dreamed of the house where she grew up, the yard filled with orange trees, the smell of cornmeal cake in the air, and her mother. "Why do you lie to this day, Eulalia?" said the woman, her eyes now sewn shut with black thread. I just wanted peace." "Lying doesn't bring peace. It brings silence. And silence, daughter, is where the devil lives." She woke with a start, with fingernail marks on her arms. She had scratched herself in her sleep. Or had she? The following week, she didn't leave the house. He received food delivery and completely isolated himself. Everything in the house seemed to want to punish him. Pictures were falling from the walls, cabinets were slamming shut, and the living room clock was now running backward. On Wednesday, the television turned on by itself. A home video of 3-year-old Laura appeared on the screen. Laughing, splashing water with her small hands. Eulalia screamed, ran to the TV and turned it off, but the image remained there, on the black glass of the screen. And then, a new message written in steam appeared on the living room window. You let her die. Eulalia fell to her knees, sobbing. Forgive me, my granddaughter. But there was no forgiveness there. Just the conscience peeling away layers of her soul like old paper. In the last scene of the chapter, Eulalia lights a candle in the kitchen and begins writing a letter. Her handwriting is shaky, her eyes blurred with tears. She describes what she did. That she knew Laura couldn't play alone. That she let her go because she didn't want to be late for tea with her friends. That she hid it from everyone out of shame. And now it's all coming back. But not as regret. As punishment. She ends the letter with a sentence. The lie protected me for years. Now it devours me. And I let it. The candle flame goes out on its own. Darkness. Summer arrived sultry in Evergreen Hills, and with it, the inevitable consequences of Ruth's actions. The neighborhood's tranquility was shattered. Neighbors murmured among themselves, casting glances that had once been filled with respect, now mixed with disappointment and distrust. Ruth noticed the changes. She was no longer greeted with warm smiles at the grocery store. At the pharmacy, the clerks no longer engaged her in conversation. Even the church she had attended for years had become a strange place. The woman who had always sat with her in the front pew now sat 2 rows back, and the once affectionate pastor barely spoke to her beyond formal greetings. But Ruth still tried to maintain the facade. She insisted to those who paid attention that it was all a big misunderstanding, that the accusations of fraud against Mr. Harold, the neighbor from whom she had embezzled part of the will, were the fruit of someone else's jealousy. However, the investigation progressed, and the truth approached like an unstoppable tide. It was on a Wednesday morning that everything fell apart. 2 cars pulled up in front of Ruth's house. They were from the State Department of Justice. It didn't take long for neighbors to peek behind the curtains. 2 officers knocked on the door. Ruth answered, dressed in her blue robe, her hair still slightly disheveled. Seeing their credentials, she knew there was no escape. Ms. Ruth Marlowe, you're being subpoenaed to testify about document forgery, estate fraud, and will manipulation. We suggest you come with us. Your lawyers have already been contacted. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded, her eyes empty and defeated. She knew time had caught up with her. The case soon became a local scandal. Headlines like "The Cheating Lady" filled the county newspapers. Interviews with Mr. Harold's relatives revealed how Ruth had exploited his vulnerability after his stroke, persuading him to change his will and transfer part of his inheritance to her, using manipulative arguments and emotional blackmail. During the trial, Ruth remained stoic. Her clothes were understated, but her gaze, once haughty, carried a weight of loneliness. When questioned about her actions, she responded coldly, I did what I thought was fair, after everything I did for him. But the jury was unmoved. The recovered audio, the forged documents, and the family members' testimonies were irrefutable. The sentence, 2 years of house arrest with electronic monitoring, partial restitution of the wrongfully inherited amount, and exclusion of any benefits related to the original will. The house, renovated with part of the embezzled money, would be auctioned to cover the costs of the lawsuit and compensation. Alone, Ruth returned to a nearly empty house. The main furniture was still there, but it felt abandoned. The flowers that once adorned the garden had wilted. The bird that used to visit her porch no longer appeared. She looked out the window every afternoon, hoping a familiar face would pass by and wave. No one did anymore. The weight of age, once mitigated by pride, descended like a storm. Back pain became more constant. Hands trembled more when holding a cup of tea. The nights grew too long. But it was there, in the silent solitude of that once prestigious place, that Ruth began to truly reflect. For the first time in a long time, she wept with regret, not for what she lost, but for what she caused. She thought of Harold, how he had trusted her as a friend, a neighbor, almost a relative. She thought of the moments she had shared with him, the laughter, the afternoons filled with tea and cookies, and then she saw herself for what she was. Someone who had hurt a man at the end of his life just to feel less invisible. And now there she was, more invisible than ever. In late autumn, Ruth began writing letters. It was her way of coping with the past. She wrote a long letter to Harold's family, asking for forgiveness, no excuses, no beating around the bush. She wrote to the church pastor, acknowledging her moral failings. She even wrote to the nurse who had once confronted her in the hospital, thanking her for being the only one who saw through her deceit. These letters didn't change what happened, but they had a small effect. The pastor returned to visit her occasionally. The nurse responded with a short but respectful letter. Harold's family never responded, but they sent a copy of the letter, attached to the lawsuit with the following note. It doesn't justify it, but it's a start. Ruth knew she wouldn't have another chance at life. Her age no longer allowed for fresh starts, but there was still time to face the truth, and hopefully, find some peace. Karma, which she thought she feared nothing, arrived subtly but relentlessly, and it wasn't in the form of public punishment, but in the pain of isolation, in the silence of the mornings, in the absence of smiles. Everything she thought she had achieved proved ephemeral. And there, between the walls she built with lies, she finally understood. The price of a lie is never just what you lose, but what you become. Summer arrived in force in the small town of Willow Creek. The flowers in front of Eleanor's house began to wilt under the scorching sun, as did the last of her patients. She sat on the porch every afternoon, watching the sparse traffic on the streets, her eyes fixed on every detail, as if searching for signs of destiny, coming her way. And it would. Ever since she began receiving the anonymous letters, written in shaky but firm handwriting, Eleanor had felt the past closing in with sharp claws. "Do you think everything is forgotten?" read the first. Then came others. "What you did will not go unpunished." And she never had a chance to say goodbye. Each envelope was like a mirror, reflecting the sins she had tried to hide for decades. Eleanor's life had always been carefully constructed around perfection. The mild, respectable widow, the former school principal, the generous woman who donated to the church and baked cakes at church fairs. But no one knew what happened to Margaret Lawson, the substitute teacher who, in 1983, dared to confront her. Margaret was sweet, somewhat naive, and charmed the students with her light-hearted teaching style. However, she noticed irregularities in the school records, students with altered grades, funds embezzled from the lunch fund, and she had the audacity to point everything out directly to Eleanor. What followed was subtle and cruel, planted rumors, false accusations of inappropriate behavior, and finally, a letter of dismissal that destroyed Margaret's reputation. Margaret disappeared shortly after, and Eleanor moved on with her life as if nothing had happened. Now, at 78, alone, Eleanor was beginning to lose sleep. The letters shook her balance. One day, one of them came with a photo. Margaret sitting on a park bench, smiling. She was aged, but alive. On the back, a handwritten phrase, "The truth always finds those who hide it." Overcome by remorse or fear of exposure, Eleanor searched for information. She discovered that Margaret lived in a small, isolated town nearby, working at a shelter for abused women. Her heart pounding, Eleanor made a decision. She would find her. Perhaps a confession would ease the burden she carried. The journey was silent. With every mile, Eleanor recalled details she'd tried to bury. Margaret's fragile tone of voice when accused, the woman's lost look as she left the school, the laughter of the other teachers covering up the injustice. When she reached the shelter, she hesitated. The place was simple, welcoming. A garden with sunflowers flanked the entrance. Eleanor waited until the end of the day to finally see Margaret. She was older, yes, but her eyes held a light that Eleanor had long since lost. When the two stared at each other, no sound came out immediately. It was Margaret who broke the silence. I knew one day you would come. Eleanor wept. She wept like a child caught lying. She told everything. She spoke of her flaws, her envy, her fear of being exposed by a younger, more competent woman. Margaret listened silently, without interrupting, only nodding. You destroyed my life, Margaret said finally. But I rebuilt it. And most importantly, I forgave you a long time ago. I just wanted you to feel a little of what I felt. And now you have. Eleanor felt herself crumble. She expected a harsher punishment, an accusation, perhaps even public humiliation. But forgiveness was the worst punishment. She realized that all this time, the only one who had truly lived trapped in the past was herself. That night, back at home, Eleanor burned the letters, one by one. Not as a way of forgetting, but as a sign of closure. The truth had been told. The weight she carried would not disappear, but it was now a known burden, no longer a hidden ghost. Willow Creek continued its leisurely pace. Eleanor returned to the porch, but something had changed. She was no longer seen as the elegant woman she once was. Some people avoided her. Others merely glanced at her curiously. But she no longer cared. Rumors swirled around town. Some said Eleanor had gone mad. Others said she had found God. But only she knew the truth. And this truth, finally, had a price. A price she finally began to pay.